All right, we're live.
Okay. Good afternoon. This is John Gessler with Jim Daniel, and we're on Murfreesboro Live. And what we're going to talk about today is Mr. Jim Daniel, history, and how he's got to where he is today, his successes, and some of the things that maybe he wished he would have changed. But mostly, we'll stick to where he was born, and we'll go through a history, and then we'll see where we may chase a few rabbits as it goes, but we'll see. Welcome.
Thank you.
You've got a lovely home.
Appreciate your saying so.
Well, thank you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Of course, this is
Okay. I was born in Corbin, Kentucky. My name actually is Doris with two R's, Dorris, Caldwell, Caldwell, Daniel Jr. But I was born in Corbin, and my family really lived in Paris, Tennessee. So my dad had gone to set up a congressman's office in Washington. And as a result, he came rushing down and found out that my grandfather had beat him to the punch and had put in the paper that Jimmy Caldwell Daniel was born on March 6, 1935 in Corbin, Kentucky, the son of Margaret and Scott Daniel. So, well, Scott is my dad's nickname. It's not even his real name either. He was Doris Caldwell Daniel Sr., but he was known as Scott in the family because he grew up on the farm, and the oldest farmhand, who couldn't really do heavy stuff anymore, went around doing the chores, and little Scott followed him. And so they started calling him Little Scott, and they grew into Scott. So I got named Jimmy by my grandfather Daniel. And then they took me off to Washington, and I grew up my first 3 years. Fourth, I lived in Arlington, Virginia, in an apartment dwelling known as the Buckingham Apartments at 205 George Mason Drive. Dad bought a house in Arlington Forest, a new development at the time. And on the night that we moved in, my mother went to the hospital, and my baby brother Scott was born. Well, Dad, as you can see, had split his name between Scott and me. But because of Granddaddy Jimbo and nobody wanting to upset him, he'd had a heart attack or something, and he was very fond of me. He just called me Jimmy. Well, that name didn't get changed until it was always surreptitiously in the school records as Doris Caldwell Daniel Jr. with Jimmy, and then it changed to Jim. And I didn't find out what my real name was until I was in the 6th grade. Everybody went out for recess, and I stayed behind a second. Just happened to look in my teacher's roll book, and I saw it. And I went home, and that.
What school was that in 6th grade? Do you remember?
Barcroft School in Arlington, Virginia, Barcroft. From there, I went to Thomas Jefferson Junior High School in Arlington, and then to Washington Lee High School there in Arlington. The way they had it set up then, junior high was 7th, 8th, and 9th grades. They figured they'd get all the fidgeting out of you and then put the sophomores, juniors, and seniors in the high school. So that's how it worked. And I went through W&L High School, and my senior year, I was in the senior play, and I was in the Variety Talent Club and the choir. And Shirley MacLaine was in the Variety Talent Club with me as Shirley Beatty, as she was known then. She was a cheerleader and a very popular girl. After we graduated, I never saw her live, but she went on to fame on Broadway and the movies. Her younger brother, Warren, was a good buddy of my next door neighbor, Muggs Simpson. They played football together at W&L. And Muggs I talked with recently, and he said he hadn't heard from Warren. They got busy in the big time and just sort of went on about their business. But we lived in a wonderful neighborhood. We all kind of stuck together. And so I've got some of the people to talk to now that were there then.
Mm-hmm.
They're not there anymore, though, incidentally. One of them lives in Northern Virginia, Marshall Simpson, known as Muggs. His brother, Keggs, who we used to call the beer baron at one point because he delivered beer, and his wife was a realtor, decided to move to North Carolina. And Frankie McLaren, who lived across the street, who had his own business, moved too. But we lived in a community where it was all new houses at the time we moved in. And my dad and some of the other people in the community formed the Arlington Forest Citizens Association, which still exists. And they had a big, well, it's not a true roundabout, but a big circle in the middle of the, near the shopping center on the far side of the Highway 50. And there was a holly tree in there, and every Christmas we'd gather around it and sing Christmas carols. And then later on, they had free movies over at the Buckingham Theater for the kids the day before Christmas, so to keep us out of our parents' hair.
So Santa Claus could work.
We weren't home shaking the presents that were already under the tree. So that's sort of the way that went. We all like to play sports, but I wasn't really fast and I wasn't outstanding, except I could throw a good pass. But Muggs and my younger brother Scott, who was 5 years my junior nearly, and that generation all came on well, and most of them did play ball if they were so inclined. We had a couple of guys that were really devoted to the piano and could play beautifully, and a girl or two up the street, one I remember, played marvelous. And so, we had an interesting situation. Right behind our subdivision was part of Lover Run Park, and it wasn't developed. There was a railroad track going through with a little trestle there, and it hauled people from Bluemont Junction down to Cameron Station around Alexandria, and then back during the war years. It also hauled some freight. And as we got older, some of us would hop the train. Nobody ever got hurt.
Well, that's good.
But the trainman got upset a couple times. We wouldn't hop it when the passenger train was on. But we had a creek that froze over, and one time it froze over enough that you could actually ice skate on down in Lover Run Park there. But it wasn't very big. Those of us that tried to ice skate landed on our bottoms a lot. but we had a good time. And so the neighborhood was a good, happy one, and we grew up there. Then along in 52, when I graduated from high school, I went to Maryville College in Maryville, Tennessee for 2 years. And then after going to Maryville 2 years and being in the Vesper Choir and being in their barn warming show and some other things, I was really into entertainment then. A friend of mine from Ohio wanted to know how to yodel, and I taught him how.
Can you still yodel?
I can't.
Yeah.
I took too much classical singing lessons. And then I had my throat cut to take out a cancerous thyroid and 2 lymph nodes about 2 or 3 years ago. And so I don't have much residuum of the vocal expertise, but I really enjoyed singing through most of my life. And back when I was 3, my mother took me to church on Capitol Hill to Sunday school. And the teacher in the class where I went asked if any of the children could sing a song. And I volunteered and said I could. And I stood up and sang, "They cut down the old pine tree and they hauled it away to the mill to make a coffin of pine out of sweetheart of mine." You know, when they cut down the old pine. Well, my mother was mortified because she was up there with Dad was working for a congressman and all of this. But the teacher said, "Don't stop him because he likes it. And if he'll sing, that'll help in the long run." So we changed over. Mom was a piano teacher's daughter, and the whole family on her side sang, and my dad sang, and Jimbo, my grandfather, and all. So Mom could play the piano and play most anything. She even played once for Shirley MacLaine to dance at one of our variety talent club things. But anyway, she and Dad immersed me in the songs of the time. Dad had a big booming voice, and he could sing all the Nelson Eddy stuff and that kind of thing. And then he could tone it down and sing Irish songs too. And Mom had gone to hear John McCormack, the world's greatest Irish tenor in the age of Caruso. And it made such an impression. She just played Irish songs all the time and liked them, but she liked sentimental songs. The whole music of the time when she was growing up was much more overtly sentimental than now. So that's kind of the family situation. My dad was an orator and a strong speaker. And he had started out to be a preacher, but then he met my mother in college, and he decided he wanted to be a lawyer. Well, he had promised his mother he would try. And he went and preached one sermon somewhere, and the people wanted to hire him, and he said, "Thank you, no, I really want to be a lawyer." And so he went on his own way. But he could spout poetry and move you. And so it was fun to watch. When I was 7, he ran for Congress. And
from Virginia? What state was he running in?
In Tennessee, here in Tennessee, from West Tennessee. The same district that his congressman had been in.
That he had worked for.
And Aaron Pearson was retiring or resigning, going back to private practice or whatnot. And so Dad ran against Tom Murray. And Tom Murray was a veteran of the First World War. And so he got a notch up, I guess. Dad lost by 600 votes when his dad died 2 weeks before the end of the campaign, or roughly that. but Dad already had a commission from the Navy in his pocket, so he could go on. And he went away for 43 and 44 and 45. First was in training at Fort Schuyler, New York, and then he went to Pearl Harbor on a general staff as an intelligence officer. Spent the time out there. Now, the side story that's interesting there is while there, he met another young naval officer named George W. Andrews from Union Springs, Alabama. His brother owned a chain of theaters. And so sometime in time to file for the 44 race, George decided he wanted to run for Congress. So he ran, but being in the Navy under the Hatch Act, he couldn't make campaign speeches. So his brother put these pictures of George in a uniform with a helmet liner and a rifle, even though he was a naval officer, and said, George is fighting for you. Vote for George. So they did. And he stayed in Washington from then on up until the time I left in 69. I think he had another term, after that or two. And he got way up in the ranks on the Armed Services Committee of the House. So George was a very interesting fellow. And he had been a lawyer in Alabama while my dad had been a lawyer in Tennessee. And every once in a while, when George's family would go back to Alabama for something and he couldn't go because of business, he'd come out and eat Sunday supper with us. And Scott and I would just sit over in the corner and listen. And those two guys would swap stories that just fascinated. I remember one about a farm worker who was riding in the back of a pickup truck with his legs dangling out over the end. And a truck coming the other way with a dead mule, a flatbed, passed them, and it broke the mule's head off and threw it in the air, came down and broke that fella's legs. And he said the testimony at that trial was just fantastic. So anyway.
That's one of those, you can't make this up.
No. And so there were all those sorts of things. Dad told me about a case he had where a fella was accused of stealing chickens. He said, did you steal those chickens? You want me to represent you? No, sir, I didn't steal those chickens. And then as soon as they tried the case and Dad got him off, he looked around and the judge says, you can go, you're acquitted. And he says, what means acquitted? Do I have to give them chickens back? So we had a lot of interesting stories. But anyway, when Dad came home from the war, my Uncle Jack, who had a farm that had partly been taken for part of Camp Tyson, barrage balloon training center for the Army.
Now, where would that be? What?
Outside of Paris, there in Henry County. They took parts of two big farms and made an Army post for a while. It's gone. They demolished it when they left, I think. But they had these great huge rings, metal rings, to hold the cables to hold these barrage balloons, so that the British planned to use them, and we planned to use them maybe, to stop Nazi strafing. And whether they were ever used, whether these guys in their cycle made it over or not, I don't know. But in World War II, well, in World War One, my Uncle Charlie had been in the Army and he got gassed and he had trouble the rest of his life. But in World War II, there was Dad in the Navy and his brother Dick, who was a year or two older, in the Army at Fort Knox in the pharmacy part because he had asthma and couldn't do the full drill bit. And then my cousin Jack Gover from Corbin was a medic with the Audie Murphy's unit and whatnot.
Really?
And he saved a lot of lives on the line. But he was very quiet about it, and we couldn't get him to talk. Scott and I were eager to know all that he'd done, and he just wouldn't talk about it until my Uncle Ralph died many years later. We were sitting at breakfast at the funeral time, and he opened up and told Scott and me about it, but he didn't want to tell anybody. Later on, we found out that every year he went, and the guys whose lives he'd saved, he kept track of, and he'd go visit them once a year, see how they were doing, just on the QT. We didn't know he was doing, but at his funeral, a fella came in who had written a book about the thing and told us about that. So, and told us about how in his own head he had a big dent because a Nazi bullet had hit him, but Jack had saved his life on that. And it didn't shatter his skull, so it was okay. But there were many other things like that.
We go to a church. One of the members of our church, he was in Korea, and he was shot twice in the forehead, and he still would go back 3 or 4 miles and take his soldiers, the U.S. soldiers, back to the aid station. And after about the second or third time he did this that night, one of the workers says, "You need some help, you're bleeding." He goes, "That's all right, I'll be all right." And he had taken, I don't know how many soldiers, a mile or two back and forth with 2 bullets in his head, and they're still there today.
That's remarkable.
That's people get done what they need to get done.
Yeah, I just watched Hacksaw Ridge the other day. Speaking of injuries and things, when I was about 8 or 9, the railroad took down overhead power lines and buried them. Well, they left a little loop up, and we used to play tag on the cliffs, which we called this sandbank. It was about, I guess, 15 feet high or so, and yet we had taken old railroad spikes and dug little roads for our tanks and whatnot. But this day we were playing tag. And so I was chasing my friend Robert Ross down the hill, and my foot tripped on one of those buried wires that wasn't quite buried and threw me into the railroad track rail. And I had a scar that went, all around here, and made me very sensitive about that for a while. Had to wear a patch. But when that happened while Dad was away in the Navy, and a neighbor took me to the hospital and took my mother and me, and Mom went in the operating room where they were sewing me up, the ER rather, and the guy was sewing it up with stitches. I had to have about 6 stitches, I think. She got a whiff of the ether and she fell on the floor. So we had all kinds of experiences, and but Mom was a very strong and resolute woman.
Now, what was her name?
Margaret Shelley Daniel. Well, her middle name originally was Walker, and then Shelley. And then she married my dad. She became Margaret Daniel. And her daddy Early Marvin Shelley, but he later changed his first name in court to Eugene because he thought Early had overtones of something he didn't want on his name. So anyway, he was a banker and an interesting fella. His daddy left to go to Texas from central Kentucky when he was 6 years old, but he didn't want to go because he didn't like his stepmother. So the granddaddy arranged for him to stay there with another woman who agreed to take care of him. And so she did, and he went through I think he went through the 6th grade, and my Daniel grandfather had gone through the 3rd grade. But he ended up as an insurance salesman. He'd been a John Deere tractor salesman, but he ended up as an insurance salesman an agent in the latter part of his life. My grandfather Shelley ran against Albert Gore Sr. for Congress in 1944 while Dad was overseas. Of course, Dad was a solid, dyed-in-the-wool Depression Democrat. And he just, so Mom didn't want to tell him until he got home. And then when he got home, he went to a Tennessee Society meeting. He came home and he told Mom, he says, Albert and Pauline seemed kind of distant toward me. And Mom laughed and said, yeah, Daddy ran against him for Congress. Well, Grandfather had been very much a Republican. That's Grandfather Shelley. And he had worked hard in East Tennessee to get the TVA in. Was in public affairs and did what he could, and worked with Senator Bora of Idaho and other people. And my mother had been born in Idaho, although her mother was from Crossville, Tennessee, and her dad was from Clinton County, Kentucky, or somewhere up that way. But they'd gone out with Grandy's brother-in-law to start a bank in Weiser, Idaho. And while they were out there, it was too cold for them. They didn't like it. So they came back to Middle Tennessee. But Mom grew up, and when her mother was 9, I think it was, her mother died. And so Granddaddy had to kind of shepherd the whole family. They were all staunch members of the First Christian Church, and they sang, and Mom played the piano and all this sort of thing. And so anyway, we sidetracked on that. But going back to the fact that Dad had come home from the Navy, and then I'd gone to Maryville. Mm-hmm. I spent 2 years at Maryville. Yeah. And then I spent 2 years at UT. And I was supposed to graduate there, but UT had a system where at the end of your junior year, before you left for summer, if you were leaving, you filed a senior standing blank. And they were supposed to review all your credits and whatnot. Well, when I'd moved in from Maryville, I asked the Dean of Admissions and Records, and he looked it over and said, everything's fine. All you have to do is get your advisors to sign off and you'll have it all. Well, came down to the end of the year. I kept going back from the falls quarter. No statement. Kept going back trying to get this senior standing thing clarified, make sure it was all okay. Well, I was in the 3rd quarter of the year, and they wanted me to go back and take either chemistry or physics, a whole year of it, because I had taken at Maryville some courses that were designed for teachers. I'd even graded one of those courses for the professor. But that was it. I had a strong interest in history. And back then, when I went in my first history class at Maryville, every question the professor asked, I'd get the answer out almost before he'd finished asking the question. So everybody was, who is this guy? And I had a good time at Maryville. Like I said, I was in barn warming shows and in the Vesper Choir, did things. But at UT, I had a wonderful time. But they rooked me on that. I worked in the radio station.
Did you?
Yes. And I was an announcer. And one night I was back listening to an opera by the Italian composer Vincenzo Bellini in the record room. And the guy came running in and said, Jim, you got to do a spot for me. So I did. He had it set up. The light was where I couldn't see the time on the clock. And I said, I read through the spot perfectly and then said, the time is 6:30. Well, it was 8:30. I'd lost what time it was, and I didn't have a watch on it. So I blew that one, and they took all the rookie announcers off the mic for a while.
That's kind of funny.
Call-ins on the radio station, WUOT and all. But I'd go to all the football games. And first year while I was still at Maryville, my cousin Flip was in the fraternity, the Phi Gamma Delta, that had a big frat house right on Cumberland Avenue, right in the heart of Knoxville, and right by UT. And so he invited me in and I went to a ball game, and then he says, well, you ought to come to this dance instead of taking the bus back to Maryville. And I said, well, I'm not exactly dressed for it. I had, a shirt that would pass with a tie, but he was so much taller than I was that we had to bring the sleeves up from here to here to let me go to the dance. But I had a marvelous time. The cheerleaders and the majorettes and what were there.
And today, you wouldn't really think about how you were dressed necessarily, especially in college. But back then, I remember Dad's stories. To go to dinner, you had to have a shirt and tie and a jacket, and the girls had to wear a dress.
Oh yeah, well at Maryville now, they were very locked down. But our daily attire, plaid shirt, blue jeans, nothing. You didn't have to dress up. I wore a kind of denim jacket around the campus most of the time. If it got a little, didn't have to put on a heavier coat. But the girls were pretty much like in prison. They couldn't wear shorts out on campus, and if they went and they were wearing shorts and they went to the library, they had to wear a raincoat and sign in, and then sign back in to the dorm when they got back. And so one winter when I was going back to DC while we still lived up there before the folks moved back to Tennessee, I rode the train up with one of my fellow choir members, Nancy Lou Dodge. She was a girlfriend of a fellow that played football. And we were talking on the way back up, and I said, isn't that awfully confining for you all? She says, well, when we're juniors, we get an extra date night. There was one night of the week that you were permitted to have a date if you weren't a junior or senior on the girls' side. But we get an extra date night, and then, that was a big deal. But she said, you wouldn't believe how naive the girls were that came in here from the surrounding country. And so she didn't feel it was too much of an imposition that they have some restrictions. But and I remember Dad telling me that when he was at Milligan College, he and Mom, they staged a dance when they weren't supposed to have dancing, you know, and all this sort of stuff. He played the edges, but that's another story. But anyway, at UT there, I had a good time. And then I went, when they told me that I couldn't graduate, they called out my name for winning a speaking prize at the graduation where my uncle and my cousin graduated, both of them. And so I said, send my transcripts to American U, George Washington U, and I think there was another, University of Maryland. And then I'll cut the best deal I can. So I got the best deal at American U. I found a very,
And that's in Washington.
yeah, I had a friend who was driving there daily anyway, or whenever he had a class, who'd been in our senior play with me, Billy Cox. And Bill and I had a great time. He had been very much the kind of guy that would read the newspaper every day and discuss public affairs and all that sort of thing. And then, but he was a good actor too, for the stocky character he was. So we had that one year at AU, and I had to take 6 hours of residence in my major field. So I took professional speakers and Renaissance literature as my 2 semesters. And 1 semester of history of philosophy. And the rest of the stuff was all radio, TV acting, radio, TV speaking, 3 voice lessons a week, and soloist in the chorus. So, and then I sang in an antique opera.
What's an antique opera?
One that was before all these big orchestras and all, you know, called Jephthah by Carissimi. And that was, and then we had a voice recital where we had to go in and sing for a jury. You picked your best. And a girl that I'd known from our choir in high school, who was a year behind me, had made it through and caught up with me in that breaking year. And so we renewed acquaintances, and I sang, you know, my aria and she sang hers. And then she was off to New York to study with somebody up there and work on a master's. Well, I wrote to her and went up and saw an opera with her up there one time. Came back to Washington. I was busy working for the National Milk Producers Federation from 57 to about 61, somewhere in there. And then in the NMPF was purely a public relations job. I went around and recorded things. I had a secret cubby hole where I could turn on an open reel tape recorder for these lobbyists that I worked for. And when they'd have somebody in, they wanted to keep a record of it, of the members of their association that paid their salaries. They would listen, and if they wanted to try to help one over another, after talking with both of them, they played one of them what the other one had said when there was a contest for baseball. Well, you know, this didn't suit my sense of ethics, but there were some other things there too that I really had qualms about, but I enjoyed the writing. I worked with an old newspaper man, improved my writing styles and all that. And then they wanted me to do a magazine. And I had told them, no, I'm starting law school at night. So it wasn't long after that that we parted ways. And I went and got a job short term with the Weather Bureau, rewriting regulations. And then while I was working there, Dr. Anthony Ellison of the DC Department of Motor Vehicles got my resume from a civil service register and read it, decided I might be what he wanted. So he called me in, and I did writing for him, but I also went out and made a lot of public appearances and spoke to groups about safety. We had some little model VW cars that we'd prop up and toss a ball out in the street, and you're not supposed to run out and get it and all that sort of thing. And so we dealt with audiences ranging up to the Navy Yard employees
Oh, really?
in Fort Belvoir and things like that.
And
On
for most
traffic
people,
safety.
they know that Fort Belvoir is a big Army base
Yeah.
right near
Alexandria. Yeah, and they would give us, I'd get letters. I don't have many of them, I think now, but they'd send Tony Ellison, my boss, letters of commendation or thank you for coming and all that sort of stuff. And I thoroughly enjoyed the job, but it got to where I couldn't have enough nights off law school. So I dropped the law for a semester or two. And I, at the National City Christian Church, the choir room one time, and we later married in the fall of, in June 8th, 1963. We had met sometime the preceding summer and got to really knowing each other and so forth during the fall, and decided we'd get married sometime after I played her a tape of my recital at Barker Hall. And so she had a wonderful alto solo voice. And we later sang for her brother, or rather her sister and her brother's brother-in-law's wedding in Lynchburg one time. And that part tapered off for me, but after we moved to Murfreesboro, that's 2 big steps down the road. Anyway, I worked for the Job Corps in Washington from 65 to 69. And that was the period of my conversion to Republicanism. And it went like this. In 64, I'd been much impressed by Goldwater and what he stood for. And then I saw how the Johnson administration, for which I was working, was spending money and paying for protesters to have buses to go places and all of this sort of stuff that I really didn't agree with.
That sounds like something that happened recently.
And Bill Buckley debated James Baldwin on the question of, police brutality and that sort of thing. And Buckley impressed me greatly. And I started reading a lot of things. And I read an article in National Review by a fellow named Harold O.J. Brown, who was a graduate of Harvard, but had gone to be a big disciple of a certain Rostrovitz, and wrote a very good, persuasive evangelical position. that I agreed with, and it just struck me. It just hit me off the page, boom, and there it was. And so I got Brown's other books, The Protest of a Troubled Protestant, that came out in the 70s there, and then Christianity and the Class Struggle. And then later, much later, after I was here in Murfreesboro, I found one called The Sensate Culture, about how things had just taken over and gone downhill in terms of morality in the traditional sense. And so Harold was very influential. Buckley was probably the most influential. I read everything of his. James Burnham and a lot of other people then, whereas I had read others back and back. But as I think back on it all, today, I was talking with my son yesterday, and we agreed that one of the greatest statements of the 20th century, excuse me, was William Faulkner's Nobel Prize speech in 1950. And it was a marvel. And if I had time, I'd read it to you, but I think we best not diverge that way. But at any rate, I also got some speeches and letters Faulkner had written, as well as his written works. I was much impressed with him. Of course, there are those who consider him the greatest novelist of the first half of the 20th century, or maybe well into the second half. And so, and I was very much taken with Shakespeare all through college. And then when I first landed at Maryville, my dad had told me about Huey Long in Louisiana. And Huey was a senator during the year that I was assassinated, that I was born. He was assassinated, excuse me, that's a fluff of major proportions. But anyway, Huey was killed the year I was born, but I heard his voice on a recording. And Dad told me, I asked him who he was. He said, Dad told me a little about him and said that when he was in the Senate, Dad was the president of the Little Congress, which was the Association of Congressional Secretaries. And he went and invited Huey Long to come speak to them because he was such a character. And so when he did, Huey took him in his office and showed him these long tables piled with money and envelopes where people had sent in to support Huey's Share Our Wealth campaign. And Huey was deemed a real threat at the time, apparently, by Roosevelt, because there was a time of great turmoil, and they had Father Coughlin and Huey Long and several others were all trying to, carve out their own niches and maybe cut down the government. So anyway, when I hit Maryville, I did a research into Huey by going to all the publications of the period and I really found out who he was. And then later on, there were some biographies that came out, but I didn't have those in the Maryville library at the time. And I bought a book by T. Harry Williams, which pretty much tracked it down. I had read Robert Penn Warren's, parallel of Huey Long, All the King's Men. And I was
so that's where that came from, All the King's Men.
And then I read Adria Locke Langley's The Lion is in the Streets, which was another patterned after Huey, but not you know,
Mhm.
a fictionalized sort of thing. James Cagney played Huey in that movie, that one. Roderick Crawford played the Willie Stark in the more famous one. But so I watched those. But Mario Lanza was really my guy in those days. He and Dennis Day, I had enjoyed Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra and all, but when Lanza blazed in on the screen, he had that Italian intensity that just touched me because I'd always been a little bit on the sentimental side anyway. And then when he could pour it out, he was the first guy I'd heard that sang like my dad.
Oh.
Now, after that, I went to Maryville, and then they took us up to Knoxville to a concert where Jan Pierce, who was a leading tenor with the Metropolitan Opera, and Bidou Sayal, who was a South American soprano, were giving a joint recital. And I got to hear Pierce, and I knew there were other big voices around then. And later I heard Pierce and Warren in a duo recital after I transferred up to UT. And Leonard Warren made a tremendous impression on me as well as Jan Pierce. Both of them were masters of their art. And Warren had the most beautiful, big, mellow baritone voice when he opened it up.
Wow.
And he could sing all the way up to a high C. He didn't do it in his concerts, but there were some recordings where when he was just playing around, he did and proved that he had it. But anyway, Warren made a very big impression on me. And the reason I went and took Cindy to the Met that one time after we graduated from AU was I had 2 tickets to hear Simon Boccanegra with Leonard Warren. And lo and behold, he was there, and it was supposed to have had Renata Tebaldi, a superstar of the Italian sopranos. But her mother had died or something, and she stayed in Italy. So they brought in an American soprano with a great big voice too. And then Warren sang an incomparable performance. And that was the last time he finished a performance at the Met. The Friday after that was on a Tuesday, I think. And the Friday after that, he died on stage after singing a big aria. He just collapsed and fell. And Richard Tucker ran and tried to give him mouth to mouth or anything, and he was gone. And Rudolph Bing had to come out and announce that, he had passed away. I wasn't there when it happened, but I've read the accounts. But anyway, Leonard Warren was my voice teacher's idol during those years when I was at the Milk Producers Federation and taking voice lessons. And so, one other thing, I got to sing for the Missouri Cherry Blossom Princess in 1962, I think it was 63. Well, it must have been about 64 that Maisie Bledsoe of Senator Symington's office, who'd been at my recital, invited me up to sing.
Now, and where was that? In Washington?
Yeah, that was in Washington during the Cherry Blossom Festival.
Those are wonderful to see after living there for all those years. The cherry blossoms are just beautiful.
Yeah, we have a Japanese cherry tree that's sort of halfway there out in our front yard. Looks like about a third of it is dying right now. But so after that, Susan and I decided that I would finish my law degree and she would work. for that about a year we had to finish, and I went a year around. But right before that, I had to go to a summer camp right after our wedding at Indiantown Gannett Military Reservation. And that was the anniversary, the 100th or whatnot of the Civil War Battle of Gettysburg. Well, Susan and I hadn't thought of that, and we thought, Gettysburg's a nice little town, let's meet there. I passed from IGMR and drove down, and Susan was supposed to meet me on a corner there that we knew, and she wasn't there. Well, it turned out I was looking for the wrong car because her car had broken down and she'd left it in Frederick, Maryland, where her college roommate had lived, Connie Shankle, and borrowed, I think, Connie's or Carol, her sister's car to come up. And then we drove back after touring the battlefield. But there were all these guys coming down with the reenactors with their tongues hanging out, the horses looking beat and all of this. And we knew we couldn't find a place to stay. So we tried all around town. Everything was booked. But we started out heading back north. And just as we were about to the edge of town, a light came on. Tourist home available. And sure enough, the guy had just gotten home. He was a pharmacist and he'd been filling prescriptions. So he turned it on and we spent the night there and then went back down to Maryland and then picked up Susan, and she was to go back and get her car a couple days later, but I drove her home and then went back to IGMR, and I left her off so she could pick the car up. And that was it. And then there was another time while I was at Fort Knox that was really instrumental in my development as a music lover. I had bought two tickets, no, maybe it's just one, to hear Collins sing at Constitution Hall. And out of Louisville. Well, I got on the plane, everything seemed all right. And then all of a sudden I heard a hubbub. And they had two DC Daniels reserved, and they hadn't caught that it wasn't the same guy. Well, my dad put the screws to him and they let him on because he was dressed in his three-piece suit with a Homburg hat and eyes that would just burn when they wanted to, you know. And so he was a real theatrical kind of guy anyway. But so we flew home together, and then I had a free ride from the airport to the house, borrowed the car and went to the concert, came back, and then he drove me back to the airport the next day and I flew out. But that hearing Maria Callas was one of the highlights of my life.
Did you ever go to the Ford's Theater when you lived in Washington?
Yes. And I went down in the basement now that they'd restored it
To the museum.
and there was a booth, a phone booth, and I said, I've got to do this. That must be the John Wilkes booth. And I threw that at one of the attendants there. But anyway, so when I parted company from Job Corps in '69, I had a job set up with the help of Senator Howard Baker's office in Memphis, and moved to Memphis, where I would be outstationed from Nashville as a field attorney. Then I had to go to a series of training sessions that were held in St. Louis for all the guys from around the country that were being trained. And so I did that. Can we pause?
Yeah. Well, we can start this up at a different time too. We can do this again.
Okay.
All right.